This is Beyond the Big Screen podcast with your host, Steve Guerra.
Thanks for joining us again today on Beyond the Big Screen. I am, as usual, your host, Steve. I am very excited to be joined by author and scholar, Dr. Susan Nagel, to discuss her book, Patriotism and Profit, Washington, Hamilton, Schuyler, and the Rivalry for America's Capital. Dr. Nagel is the author of numerous books and articles, including Maria Theresa, Child of Terror. Dr. Nagel, thank you so much for joining us today on Beyond the Big Screen.
It's my pleasure.
Now, this book outlines the story of how Washington, D.C. became the capital of the United States, and this book breaks some of the myths surrounding the compromise to establish the capital in its current location. What made you write this book?
Well, I was really fascinated by New York City as the nation's capital between the years 1785 and 1790. Those years reminded me of the go-go 1980s. Very, very similar. We had a small group of people who led the social world, the political world, the rise of Wall Street. We had the first hedge fund guy who failed. We had Alexander Hamilton, John Jay, and the mayor, Jim Duane. And all of their wives were first cousins. So it was a kind of interesting outcome because they'd all been through the Revolutionary War, and their wives were leading things like the abolitionist movement, organizing charity fundraisers for hospitals. And I thought, wow, history really does repeat itself. And then I wondered, why on earth would they leave New York? Everybody loved it. Even Abigail Adams, who criticized everything, she was very unhappy when it was decided that, the capital city would be leaving New York. And she said, wherever they go, it will not be Broadway. So that got me going on this long, winding road because I found out that actually it was George Washington who had masterminded a deal. And of course, if you look on Wikipedia, they always mention the compromise of 1790 and the great dinner table bargain that Thomas Jefferson claimed to have solved all the world's problems at this dinner. So I kept on digging and digging. That's what I really love to do. And I discovered that, in fact, he'd come back from France at spring, had very little role in the whole bargain, which was we'll provide federal funding for debt, Alexander Hamilton's program. And then the capital would move to some other place. And the story really goes back, I think, to the birth of two men, Philip Schuyler, senator from New York, and Alexander Hamilton's father-in-law, and George Washington. So Alexander Hamilton was actually caught in the middle of these two men who adored him and whom he, viewed as mentors. And Thomas Jefferson wrote this story a couple of years later, and he kept on writing it and rewriting it and telling the story because he wanted to insert himself as, the great negotiator. And he wanted to sanitize Washington's role in this whole kind of very subterfuge kind of deal making.
Yeah, so that's the thing that I came back to is why create this myth? And you think that it's the creation was really to rise George Washington above the fray of this kind of interesting land deal?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Every empire has a founding mythology. Ancient Greece, the Romans, England, every warrior we study for years and years, and George Washington certainly was a warrior. And the cities were the center of finance and government. And then all of a sudden, 1790, they pull the city away from New York, the capital city, to a swamp. And that's the first time, except for a minor moment in Dutch history, that the financial capital and the political capital will be in two separate places. And then after that, lots of governments followed us.
Now, one thing that your book brought up, and that it's a question that whenever I read about American history, it keeps coming up. Land was so incredibly important for early American, these aristocratic families, you might almost call them, like George Washington and the Schuylers and numerous other ones. What was separating them from Britain? Were there aristocrats, like actual lords and barons and so forth in England who owned large tracts of lands. It almost seems like at this point, like right before the revolution, that they're almost de facto separate.
Well, actually, I'll comment on two of your points. One is George Washington was not considered an aristocrat. The Virginia aristocrats were in the southern part of the state along the Tidewater coast, James River, York River, Williamsburg, that area. His family bought land farther north on the Potomac, which was considered lower class and less valuable because it was farther inland. The other point I'd like to address is New York State was settled by the Dutch, and they were given these baronial parcels of land to develop and settle people, and that they actually were called lords of the manor, things like that. A lot of the disputes that took place between among the states, even after the Revolutionary War, happened because the British gave charters that were very vague. And, in those days, I joked in the book, a compass and a the kind of thing, that's how they determine land. You walk so many steps, you marked a tree. You walk so many steps, you marked a tree. Well, if a charter says, you're 10 trees from this other tree, it's really hard to determine whose property is whose. So, for example, Philip Schuyler owned a lot of property east of the Hudson River, and Massachusetts people claimed that. Virginia owned what today is also West Virginia. So George Washington collected land. He amassed it himself along the Kanawha River in what is now West Virginia and north of the Potomac into Pennsylvania, because his thinking was, I'm going to one way or another have land along the Potomac River and connect to the Ohio River. And Philip Schuyler, the Dutch, of course, were thinking the Great Lakes, the Hudson River to the Mohawk, to the Great Lakes, the Erie Canal. That was a very early idea that Philip Schuyler championed.
Now you mentioned that. I like that, how you called it that Washington collected land, because it really does. He got a little piece. He got a piece of land here, a piece of land there. And it wasn't particularly valuable land because a lot of the more valuable land had already been claimed. But what were those key pieces that he really wanted to accumulate? He
wanted anything that was along a riverside. Waterside property was everything because river travel was everything. Also, they had brought over the European tradition of private ownership of rivers. So, for example, if you owned a piece of property along the Potomac River, you could actually collect tolls and duties, and you would be phenomenally rich. So he tried to collect it along the riverside and along the rivers that were tributaries of the Potomac, because he believed the Potomac River would eventually connect with the Ohio River, that there would be a canal system and that it would be very easy. And if you take that east, you could get to Alexandria, which would be the capital of the world, and of course, just a few miles from his house.
So that's a convenient. How far is it from the Potomac, where the Potomac's navigable, to the Ohio?
Well, the biggest problem was the Great Falls, and that's around Georgetown, a little north of Georgetown. And that's part of the later story of kind of the things he tried to do as a real estate developer. He really was, the first real estate developer president of the United States was the very first president of the United States. He was a real estate developer, and he was, I wouldn't say ruthless, but you could say ruthless. He would send frontmen out to buy land and say, just don't tell them I'm the one behind this. He would send family members and friends to put together parcels of land and say, just don't tell anybody I'm part of this. He also collected some land as part of his award from the 7 Years' War. And he went out to see his land and discovered that actually there were farmers living on this land who predated the 7 Years' War. They'd been there a long time. They were farming it. And he said, well, too bad. I own it. And he went and he sued them and kicked them off his land.
Would you say that George Washington was a real estate speculator, or was he a value investor?
That it's a bit of both, and many of our founding fathers went collectively into business and investing and speculating in land. When George Washington visited Philip Schuyler, they were best friends. He took a tour of the Mohawk River, and he knew that this was the easy way to the Great Lakes. So he invested with Governor George Clinton in a parcel of land. He couldn't afford the land that Philip Schuyler had. But he did invest with a group. It took him years to pay back George Clinton. James Madison and Thomas Jefferson, James Monroe, they all invested in land, and they all wanted waterside properties. The men in Maryland, the Carrolls, another Virginian, George Mason, they all invested in land as groups. And of course, they all tried to start canal companies.
I think it's interesting. There's even a little fact you included in the book that makes a parallel between today and George Washington, that he was even making different purchases in Florida land schemes.
Well, Thomas Jefferson did a lot of that in Western Florida. And when he was negotiating Louisiana Purchase, of course, today we would wonder about that in the emoluments clause going, he gets money out of this. Washington, of course, was president of the canal company, the Potomac Canal Company, and its largest shareholder while he was president of the United States. So there are a lot of these kind of conflicts of interest. Do I think they were shady or anything like that? It was a different time. They were really born British, and they had a lot of European traditions that they had to learn to shed. So when Alexander Hamilton and James Madison were writing the Constitution, they addressed a lot of this, knowing that in the future there would be questions that people would ask. And so they tried to address things. But it was difficult for people born, under a British king and with the old world traditions to kind of find a footing in this new republic.
The emoluments clause, was that something that Hamilton and the framers of the Constitution, that they originated, or did they have a connection to something, a grander idea of that?
Well, they did. James Madison and Alexander Hamilton. Alexander Hamilton also tried to invest in land. He didn't have much money, but he did a little bit. Now, they also, because the rivalry in the book that you read about is between the two states of Virginia and New York, and of course the best friends, Schuyler and Washington, who wanted to develop canal systems and have the center of this country either be in New York City, Philip Schuyler, or to be in Alexandria, Virginia, George Washington. So they set about trying to, race each other. And there are letters with Thomas Jefferson to George Washington saying, we've got to beat those Yorkers. We've got to beat those Yorkers. And they spent many, many letters taking measurements, painstaking measurements to find the shortest route to the Ohio River or the Great Lakes, and why Alexandria, Virginia really should be the center of this country, the capital city. So there was this intense rivalry, and there to the Constitution, writing the Constitution, the Federalists, Alexander Hamilton from New York, whose father-in-law is Philip Schuyler, and of course his surrogate father is George Washington, and James Madison, who's a Virginian and idolizes Washington. When they attacked the writing of the Constitution, their attitude was, all of these people are killing each other, our friends, our families, for what end? Toward what end? What good? We should have the Constitution say that Congress will fund infrastructure and it will be publicly owned instead of the European way, privately owned with toll booths and, Mr. Smith collects until you pass to his neighbor. And it was shot down. So to this day, really, Congress never delegated the authority to fund infrastructure. They do it on two other bases. But a lot of the problems that we still look at today were ones that Hamilton and Madison addressed because they saw it all around them.
Philip Schuyler's an interesting historical character, and I'm from New York and from Buffalo, and the Erie Canal is like, it's folklore. It's, you learn it from from before you even go to school. But Schuyler's name doesn't come up. Can you maybe tell us a little bit about Philip Schuyler?
Sure. They're so intertwined that it's every person. There's about 4 or 5 families. They all married each other for generations. So Philip Schuyler was a Schuyler. He was a Van Rensselaer. He was a Van Cortlandt, and they all married each other in a Livingston. And he was a very interesting character because his father died when he was very young, just like George Washington's. And a lot of the people were afraid to go to the interior of the country. They kind of hugged the East Coast. Schuyler went off exploring. He met with Native Americans. He learned the languages. He went himself on the river routes to see where things turned out. He spoke Dutch, English, French, and the Native American languages. He went off in the 1860s to study the canal systems in England. The Bridgewater Canal opened. He had vast estates. And of course, in New York City, he kind of spearheaded the capital city, the buildings, the fundings, and all of that to make the Congress welcome here because they weren't welcome in a lot of places.
And now, a brief word from our sponsors. What lands did Schuyler own that were particularly important for his ideas on building his Grand Canal?
Well, his property was around the Albany East area and Saratoga and along the Mohawk River. So you can imagine the waterside value to that property, Albany, Mohawk River, up and down the Hudson, north and east, and then west through Saratoga.
Washington and Schuyler were legitimately good friends as well.
Absolutely. Washington was godfather to one of the children. Washington stayed at their house. They wrote back and forth. He was one of the few people, meaning Schuyler, that Washington would address as, my dearest friend with great affection, because although he wasn't frosty, but he tried to be proper and correct because his background wasn't as aristocratic as some of those Virginians.
Was it as important in New York to be aristocratic as it was, or it appears to be in Virginia?
Well, it's very different because upstate New York along the Hudson was controlled by these Dutch clans, and the amount of land they owned was massive. Van Rensselaer is still, Stephen Van Rensselaer, the one who married Schuyler's daughter, is still considered in the top 10 of the all-time richest Americans. He had almost 1 million acres. That's a lot.
Yeah.
In New York City, however, what is true about New York City today was true about New York City in those days. It was a melting pot. It was a true melting pot. It was a deep water harbor. So, the arrival of Jews from Brazil who had left Portugal in 1648 established a community and the oldest synagogue in New York City. There were French, German, Scandinavians, all kinds of ethnicities were in New York City. That was always considered a melting pot.
What was the relationship between Schuyler, Hamilton, and Washington? Was there any degree of jealousy, or were they all, basically a happy family?
Well, for the most part, they were a happy family. Alexander Hamilton got annoyed with George Washington. And it's a kind of sweet story because Hamilton wanted to fight in the war and Washington wanted to keep him by his side. Hamilton was so incredibly accomplished, and Washington thought, of course, he could be really useful to him in an office capacity. And B, he really loved him like a surrogate son. He didn't want to see him die. So at one point, Hamilton was really annoyed with Washington, like, why won't he let me do what I want to do, like a hot-headed young man? And he wrote to his father-in-law, I've had it with Washington. I'm so annoyed. He just won't let me do what I want to do. And Philip Schuyler said, just keep your temper, young man. Just hold it, take a deep breath. It'll be okay. And just go and just ask in a nice way. And he did ask in a nice way and eventually got what he wanted. But, there were moments of friction with Washington like that. But he absolutely revered his father-in-law. And once he became a member of that Dutch aristocratic clan, he was part of a solid, very, very tightly knit group of people with tons of money.
Why do you think that Schuyler's name is not as well known as especially some of the other players in this book of Hamilton and Jefferson and Washington, when Schuyler is really critically important to every step of the way in the foundation of this country?
Yeah, he really is. And I don't know why he's been overlooked, but he's the one who got the bill passed to build canals in New York State. And that was in 1784. He also is tremendously important in the relations with the Native Americans. And he actually designed the Battle of Saratoga that turned the war, but he was kind of dismissed right beforehand. And both Schuyler and Washington shared a nemesis, the man who took over running the Battle of Saratoga. And that was, they commiserated about the same person.
Yeah, that's amazing that they all had trouble with Horatio Gates. They all, they're both huge landowners. They're both, critical in the foundation of their states and the foundation of the entire country. I mean, down to the selection of the capital.
And I love a couple of stories about the Schuyler family that aren't very well known. One of them is General Burgoyne came to burn the Schuyler estate of Saratoga. And before he got there, they sent word to Mrs. Schuyler and said, Burgoyne is coming. And she thought, they have these beautiful fields and it'll make wonderful food for the British Army. And she said, burn the fields. Really. And after Burgoyne lost the Battle of Saratoga, of course, he was an enemy. And Philip Schuyler hosted him at his house in Albany and gave him his own bedroom. And Burgoyne, who had been told, Americans are peasants and they have no class and all this stuff, wrote back to Britain, to people in England, said, this is the most Christian and most aristocratic man I have ever met.
Now, what were the really central issues? New York seems to be kind of the de facto capital. It seems like the natural capital, but that you have Washington who wants to move it to the land that he owns. What are some of the critical issues that are involved in getting the capital moved?
Well, we have the southern states and we have the northern states. So first we have distance. You have to be fair to everybody. Now, the South Carolinians took their boats up to New York City, and they were all for New York City. There was an event that happened in June 1783, and that was the first invasion of the Capitol building as we knew it then. So the one that happened this year is by far centuries later than when this first happened. In June of 1783, our nation's representatives were meeting at the State House in Philadelphia, the Independence Hall. The soldiers had not been paid. So they got word that 500 unpaid soldiers were on their way to the state, this Capitol Independence Hall. They called an emergency meeting on a Saturday to try to negotiate with them. The soldiers were so angry, and a lot of them had been drinking all day. So they held the bayonets up to the windows of Independence Hall and almost killed all of our founding fathers. Our founding fathers slid out a back window. And in those days, every state had different jurisdictions. So if you slid out a back window or you committed a crime in Pennsylvania, you could go to New Jersey and live scot-free. So they ran out the back door, and then for at least a year and a half, our nation's capital was roving. There was no capital. They met in Trenton. They met in Annapolis. They met in Princeton, New Jersey, where they shared beds, and it was pretty horrible. So at Christmas time of 1784, John Jay, who just returned to the States, he had been living in Paris and in Spain, and he participated in the treaty, came back to New York, and they had offered him the Secretary of State position. He said no, because the capital was moving all over the place. He said, I'm weary. I would like to live at home in New York City with my wife, and that's it. That December 1784, close to Christmas, members of the House of Representatives, our legislative body, started going home. John Jay rode down to Trenton. He said, I will reconsider this if you move to New York City. And they said, sure, done deal, let's go. It seemed like a very, off the cuff, nonchalant type of moment. But in fact, the Virginians had been terrified that this would happen because they knew that once the capital moved to New York City, nobody would want to leave. It had been the 7 years of war. The British had occupied New York City. It was a loyalist town, totally burned to the ground. And these families, the Dutch clans, rebuilt it overnight. There were theaters and dance galas, balls, charity balls of women who were all first cousins in this little group, young and pretty, and they built hospitals. They started an abolitionist society, and this went on for 5 years. Why would anybody want to leave New York City?
So the capital starts in Philadelphia, and then it moves to New York City, but then Philadelphia is selected as a temporary capital.
Right.
Maybe just to wrap up Philadelphia's story, why does Philadelphia seem to get cut out of the big game here?
That mutiny in June was enough. They had made big decisions after that, mostly that they would never allow the federal district to be within a state jurisdiction. And I know nowadays they keep talking about Washington, D.C. as a state. The founding fathers would be horrified because they wanted it to have sovereignty. The governor of Pennsylvania did not help when the soldiers marched on Independence Hall, and he was in control. He was the governor of the state. So they had decided when we write our Constitution, when we pick our capital city, it will be sovereign. It will not be within the state. That was one decision they made. The other decision was they would not go back to Philadelphia after that. And Pennsylvania kept apologizing and begging them to come back. We've learned the ills of our ways and stuff. But frankly, people didn't want to be around the Quakers. They had so much fun in New York. There was gambling and drinking and outdoor amusement parks. There were racetracks. There was nothing like that in Philadelphia.
Were the people at the people who were in charge in New York and who were really pulling for New York City to be the capital, were they willing to give New York City up as a federal district?
Well, see, this is the myth that Thomas Jefferson created. The song about Alexander Hamilton selling New York down the river, that didn't happen. The whole story about the dinner table bargain is a myth that Thomas Jefferson wrote. He started writing it a few years after the Residence Act, when the capital was removed from New York City. He made Alexander Hamilton the bad guy because he was jealous of him. And by that time, he really hated Hamilton. And he inserted himself as a great negotiator when, in fact, he was pretty irrelevant to the whole thing. It really went back to, decades earlier when Washington had surveyed Alexandria and helped form the city. And Philip Schuyler was dreaming of canal systems for New York State. So the story goes back that far. So how are they going to bring the two ends together? They need to get Alexander Hamilton's federal funding bill through, and some states had already paid their debts and didn't want to get involved in this. And George Washington wanted that to happen, and he wanted the federal city to move. So I am not going to give away the political machinations because they're juicy, but Washington was a masterful politician, and he did all of this behind the scenes lobbying and arm twisting, and he made promises, which he broke. And that's why both of the things were passed pretty much at the same time. He oversaw both of them, but stayed in the shadows. And if you read some of the diaries and journals at the time, like Senator MacLeod of Pennsylvania, he said, Washington is behind this whole mess. Everybody's not saying it out loud, but Washington, he's the one behind the whole thing.
Washington does seem to be able to stay above the fray. Did people look to him as a major political player who was attackable, or was it somebody who they had to really play with kid gloves with?
There were no political parties yet. But if you had to say there were political parties, basically there was bipartisan criticism of him. Of course, Horatio Gates thought he was an inept general. There were constant mutinies from soldiers. You remember the Newburgh episode where he took his glasses off and wept and said, I've grown weary, leading all you men. There were people who constantly vied for his job. There were people in New York who criticized the fact that he rode around in a gold coach that was very lavish. He also did not get a salary for his services in the Revolutionary War. He said, I'll just take expenses. Well, the expenses were hundreds of thousands of dollars. So he was criticized for that. And then when they offered him the position, to be president of the United States, they said, we're going to give you a salary this time, because they were afraid of what kind of bills he would run up. So there was criticism in a macro world, though. Of course, he was famous around the world. The Europeans wrote about him, saying he was an American, warrior hero. So if you are going to write a founding myth of the country, of course, your warrior hero is George Washington, and he is the first president. And it makes sense in terms of founding an empire. And Thomas Jefferson knew that. They were all very well read. So he sanitized the story of Washington as a cutthroat real estate developer and his role behind the scenes. And instead, Thomas Jefferson inserted himself and put poor Alexander Hamilton in the hot seat.
How did Washington directly benefit from this move? Like, what was his bottom line with having the capital move from New York to his slice of land?
Well, here's the thing. He was president and the largest shareholder of the Potomac Canal Company. At the same time, he was president of the United States. As I said, these were the beginnings of people who had conflicts of interest, and you can't actually say they were evil, but they were trying to figure out, how do I go from private profit to general public good? So when he promised that he would move the capital to a certain location, he crossed his fingers behind his back, and it didn't happen. He selected the location. It was not in the residence bill. I'm not going to tell you why and how he did it, but he really angered a lot of people. And part of making the Potomac navigable, he thought he could get federal funding for it, and he couldn't. And by the time he died, the Potomac Canal Company was bankrupt. It was revived many years later, in 1825, as the Chesapeake and Ohio Canal Company by President James Monroe, another Virginian with property along the Potomac. And you have to realize the Erie Canal had opened and was a great success. So there was that old Virginia-New York rivalry again. So Monroe came up with an excuse as to why the government should fund infrastructure, which it was never going to do.
And canals were really the cutting edge of transportation and really information technology.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And that was, we, after the Louisiana Purchase, especially, we had so many settlers moving west. So having the rivers open up, that was the logical thing. You needed it for commerce, you needed it for defense.
Now, kind of wrapping up, we see that certain people like Thomas Jefferson, he's been reimagined lately, and we can see him as a more full person. And the same thing with Alexander Hamilton. He was kind of always a little bit of the bad guy. And now we see that he's he's a more full character. Do you think it's really possible for us to see George Washington as a full person and not a myth?
Well, that's what I'm hoping this book does. I'm hoping that people look at this book and say, wow, he was an entrepreneur. He was a really interesting businessman. He actually designed a village, much like a Lefrak City or a Levittown. And he designed the whole town with mills and houses and things like that. So he was a visionary and a very interesting and energetic guy. And I hope people look at him in a new way and say he wasn't just some wooden soldier who waved at crowds. He was human. He might have been flawed like all of us. He was a man of his time, and he was also very much a visionary. And I would love for people to really read about what he dreamed about.
Through doing this research and writing this book, who do you think, what was maybe a person or event that really stuck out and stays with you even to today?
Well, this is a small moment, but I love the moment when our House of Representatives in Philadelphia, we were not yet a nation, but they were going to declare war on the British. And George Washington and Philip Schuyler get on their horses and ride out of town side by side, right by each other to lead us into war. And Philip Schuyler really was his right-hand man, his most trusted major general.
Well, I want to thank you so much for coming on the show today. I mean, I think that people should really read the book because it's drama, it's history, it's a incredible story that I think people should know because it's a major building block to what our country is.
Well, I agree with that. I hope they do read the book. And I thank you so much for inviting me on the show. It's really been fun, talking about all this with you.
Thank you again for listening to Beyond the Big Screen podcast. I want to give a big thanks to our guest today, Susan Nagel, author of Patriotism and Profit, Washington, Hamilton, Schuyler, and the Rivalry for America's Capital City. Links to learn more about Susan Nagel and her book can be found at simonandschuster.com or in the show notes. A great way to support the Beyond the Big Screen podcast is just by leaving a rating and review on Apple Podcasts or your podcatcher of choice. It helps me know what you think about the show. It also lets other people know about the show through the power of algorithms, or at least so I'm told. You can connect to me by going to the website a2zhistorypage.com. There's links to the social media there. You can also send me a good old-fashioned email to my email address, steve@a2zhistorypage.com. I would love to hear your comments, feedback, suggestions for guests, topics, books, and movies, and much more. You can find links to that and more in the show notes, and I will see you beyond the big screen.